Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah, amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the first episode of the Muslim Parent Podcast. With me, your host, Shaheen Rahman, and I have with me today a very special guest, Shaykh Shams al-Duha. Shaykh Shams is a very well-known scholar of England. He was the co-founder of Ibrahim College, and he's the current founder of Mawarid Lifestyle, and he also serves as the managing director of Ilmuna. It's a very pleasure to have you here. Sheikh Shams also has over 25 years of experience in teaching, in educating, as well as in three distinct age groups, and that is children, teenagers, as well as adults. So we are honored to have you here, Sheikh Shams. Hayakallah.
Hayakallah. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Marana Shaheen. Pleasure to be here. Alhamdulillah, this is our first one, inshallah ta'ala. So
Hopefully it'll be the
inshallah,
first
this
of many,
will be
inshallah.
beneficial, inshallah, for us as well as for our communities, inshallah.
Okay, so Sheikh, for younger parents or parents of younger children like myself, we would look to parents of older children like yourself about raising our children to be strong, confident Muslims in Britain. So to ask you directly, are your adult children still Muslims?
Wow. Alhamdulillah, my adult children are Muslim, alhamdulillah. And it's all down to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But yes, gosh, that was blunt.
So alhamdulillah, okay, that's great to hear. So of course we acknowledge the privilege that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, or gives yourselves, gives parents when it comes to raising their children. But of course there are naturally going to be things that you have to do as parents, or we have to do as parents to raise our children to become confident Muslims. How do you manage that one?
So look, I always have to caveat this, right? Because one of my children is 17, and I don't like to think that, like sometimes people can be really, they can be quite absolute in what they think is good parenting and what the solutions are. I don't like to think like that. So as far as I'm concerned, my eldest looks like he's now stable in his in who he is and in his Muslim identity. I think there's still a few years to go with my middle son, who is still a teenager. But so far so good, and I still have a long way to go with an 8-year-old. So I'm not going to say it's all done, absolutely not. And I suppose it's never done. I think my father's, I think 78, something like that now. And wallahi, no joke, he still parents me, right? He still parents me proactively. We're not talking about a relationship where I just go and I show some respect and he tells me off about something. I'm talking proper conversations. So, I'm not going to come at this as here's your answers, here you go, simply because we live in unprecedented times, and therefore we have to. Probably the most important thing is you have to constantly be on your toes. So I think the first thing I'm going to say is vigilance and just being constantly on my toes, being extremely observant of the children in terms of their personalities. And then comes perhaps everything else that is often discussed in terms of parenting.
Okay, barakallah feek. So when it comes to raising teenagers specifically, because I'm at the age when my children are not teenagers yet, but they are nearing the age, so that gives me a lot of worries and a lot of anything can happen, and not necessarily to the stage of panic, but I do wonder how to raise my children when they become teenagers. So considering at least two of your children are current teenagers, where would you say the biggest struggles are that were different from what you expected? So I don't mean the usual, hygiene and just, going to school and mingling with the wrong people, things like that. Although if that's what you want to speak about, fair enough. You're more than welcome to do that. But my question is more about the things that we don't expect, but life just comes at us.
Yeah, I think the obvious things, teenagers have always been teenagers, right? So I think some of the obvious things are still relevant. I think it's also important to recognize that um, every teenager is different. Every child is a personality, is a unique personality. So not everybody's challenges will be the same. Um, and that's why I don't like to speak about parenting in terms of guaranteed results. I think hearts are in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And given how turbulent this can be, and given how unpredictable it can be, it's even more important that we do our best, right? Our absolute best as we raise the children from a young age, rather than allow the kind of narrative I just presented. Every child is unique, and you don't know, you can't predict everything. That kind of narrative sometimes leads people to just leave things to chance, right? It's going to be fine. We've survived, and so on and so forth. People often do that. So that's I think that's the first thing. I think we have to frame it in that way, that every child is different. And I think what we do as parents to try to raise our children the right way, um, I think what it does is, rather than think of it as guaranteeing results, it raises the probability of good outcomes. And then for a smaller percentage of families and parents, there will still be the life is a test aspect, right, of our Islamic outlook towards life, which will present itself as challenges with our children. So that will always happen. I think it will happen to good parents who've done everything right, and they might still have trouble with their parents. So um, I think we have to be prepared for that as well. But what good parenting will do, what best practices will do, and what vigilance will do, is it will increase the probability of your children being raised right and not facing severe and significant challenges. And then, should they face challenges later, it will increase the probability of them coming out of that, of them finding Toba, of them returning back to um, their parents. Sometimes that might happen. Sometimes the trouble might just be that the children have left home. Sometimes it's going to be to do with religiosity and so on. But chances are that there's a greater probability of them returning and of them making Toba. So I think those are some really, really important principles, I think, that we have to take into consideration in terms of expectation. I think people's expectations are all over the place. On the one hand, it's like, yes, I'm following this person who's giving really good parenting tips, I'm going to be okay. On the other hand, oh, this stuff doesn't work. Look at so and so who did everything well, that religious family, but their child did this and did that. So I think expectations are important. Beyond that, again, if we stick to the broad principles, look, we live in times, and in unprecedented times, number one. Number two, we live in times that change faster than we can keep up, right? So you raise, my children have a bit of a gap, yeah, between them. So my eldest is 5 years older than the next one, and just between those two, the challenges were different. All right. um when my eldest was growing up, uh I remember, his baby photos were taken on one of those brick phones, one of those early Nokias, not the earliest ones, but the early ones that had a color camera, right? I recently looked up those photos. And I think we just had early broadband, right? We didn't have smartphones yet. By the time when you look at the photos of my second child, they're crisper. Smartphones have arrived. um everything's changed, right? And then you might think, okay, after that, how much more can things change, right? Now with my youngest, we've got AI. And my as an imam, as somebody who talks to the community a lot, my observation is that the majority of people don't see these things as serious challenges, right? This is one of the biggest concerns. The pace at which things change present serious challenges. This is the most important thing for parents to recognize, and they have to adapt to this.
So you mentioned about having expectations, and people's expectations are different. And one thing you mentioned was challenges. I think that word could be a little bit vague, because for some people, a challenge could be you want your teenager to make you a cup of tea and they say no, or you want your child to come home at a certain time and they don't. And others can look at challenges as more theological or ideological, where you want to raise them as believers in God and servants to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they're not particularly interested. Or you want to safeguard them from foreign ideologies that are detrimental for their own well-being, let alone Islam, or let alone their their spiritual well-being. So I think in terms of challenges, what are we exactly speaking about here?
So look, there's as Muslims, obviously challenges to Iman are going to be the most important, right? But on top of that, we have to raise good human beings, right, with good personalities. You can have somebody who prays 5 times a day, and in your assessment is very, very unlikely to face a challenge to their Iman. A challenge to La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. That's unlikely. That's everybody's assessment. But the guy is a complete obnoxious moron. Somebody you wouldn't want to go anywhere near. They're just not a nice person. So one of our other challenges is we need to raise good human beings, compassionate human beings, loving human beings. We need to raise young people who have a certain degree of hikmah and wisdom about them, right? So intelligence and wisdom, not in the academic sense. You have lots of people who have loads of A stars in their GCSEs and A levels, and have degrees, firsts in their degrees, and so on and so forth. And strangely, their intelligence levels, their ability to apply common sense, to function in society, to maintain relationships, to have good judgment, to have discernment, to be fair when they evaluate something, it's just appalling. They just don't have it, right? They're irresponsible. You would never entrust a child to them. You'd never entrust, let alone a family, and so on, right? And if you knew them really, really well, you'd never consider them as potentially a husband for your daughter, and or a wife for your son, right? So like when you reach my age, these are certain considerations. And when I think, okay, my kids are going to get married, my nephews and nieces are going to get married, like, what's the most important thing? And I tell myself, definitely not academic qualifications, right? The first thing is, okay, what is their level of wisdom? In Bengali, we call it akhol. And I think they've really got this concept spot on, right? So that's number 2, right? So the Iman element, and then number 2. And the third is we have to turn them into, and this is the least important one, but important nonetheless, right? We have to turn them into people who are economically competent. In today's day and age, that's very, very important. In the olden days, in my father's generation, especially when they were back home before they migrated, being economically competent meant being able to farm and look after animals, right? Obviously, the conversation is different now. So that point about economically competent, I have some friends who have wider ideas on this, but that economic competence is really important. Yeah. So challenges in these three areas, I would say, are challenges, and I think it's fairly. I can fairly confidently say that for most people, these three, this 1, 2, 3 order that I just gave you is reversed.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
People think economically competent, good human being, Muslim.
Yeah.
Right? Even if they verbally say that's not their priority, most Muslims will say no. Being a good Muslim is number one. It's not how they raise their children. That's very important to recognize.
Yeah. Just to use an English word for akhol, if we were to translate as maturity, just for the sake of convenience here, then usually people would correlate between intelligence and maturity, or the more learned and the more cultured you are, the more maturity and just overall better attitude and sensibility you tend to have. So in your experience as not only as a parent but also as a teacher, and of course somebody who's taught both teenagers and adults and even young children, where do you think, if at all, there is a disconnect between raw intelligence, or let's just say mathematical ability or academic achievement, and emotional and just general maturity, or akhol, as you were to say?
I think it falls in the character development space, right? It falls in the character development space. And I think maturity is definitely an element to it, but you can also argue that maturity is a particular point in time in a person's development, right? Everyone matures at some point, but sometimes it's too late. You mature too late. You know, all the damage is done. You've lost your relationships. You know, you've lost your siblings already. Perhaps lost a spouse. Worse still, lost your children. So, and I've seen this. You know, like you see people, they've lost it. They can't rebuild their relationship with their children because when they realized that what they'd done, it was too late.
Could you give us examples?
So I would say, you know, it's like one example just popped into my mind, right? You know, somebody lost their children because of how they were with the children's mum, right? This happened all the time. Happens all the time. It's very, very common. So there's so many other things, you know, absent fathers lose their children because of how absent they are. Even if a mother is proactive in trying to retain a child's relationship with their father or their mother, it happens the other way, not as frequently. Sometimes children, when they hit 14, 15, 16, they decide for themselves, I don't want to have anything to do with this guy because he was absent from my life and he was absent from my mum's life and my mum had to suffer alone. So there's so many ways in which you can lose your children. I'm just picking at the extreme end. Yeah, what was the original question?
The disconnect between akhol, or
maturity. So I think the disconnect, so I think akhol or aql, if you want to use the Arabic term, which we've obviously turned into some, you know, into something else now, both on the Arabic end and the Bengali end. So I think this idea of intelligence is, you know, a broader idea of intelligence sits within character development, and I think it has a lot to do with judgment, right? So judgment, compassion, the ability to have to be a person of mawadda and rahma, which I think
could you just translate those for the listeners?
So mawadda and rahma is the love and mercy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says he puts in a marriage, right? And I think that love and mawadda aren't just about the relationship between husband and wife. It's about the whole family. Love and mawadda secure the relationship between a husband and a wife, but also secure the relationship, secure the family, right? Secure the family, secure the extended family, secure the clan. right? Because these are really, really powerful community attributes. And I think you put all of that together, right? Justice, you know, mawadda, rahma, love, and mercy. You know, you can add compassion to kind of this group, if you like. And you find that people become a better rounded person, because you don't want just, if you mirror it against Allah's attributes, right? You know, our iman sits between love and between hope and fear, right? Iman is between hope. Al iman bayn al khawfi wal raja. So iman is between hope and fear. These are reflective of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rahmah and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice, right? If you were to now take those and mirror them in a human being, what you would get is a better balanced human being. Attributes of Jamal, attributes of beauty, softer attributes, and attributes of justice coming together make people who are far more balanced, I think. And I think these are things parents have to be wary of. One of the things I've noticed about elders, by the way, like my dad's generation, the generation before, is they weren't, my dad never spoke to me about qualifications, never spoke to me about university. I think my father-in-law was like that as well. I think that whole generation were like that. They didn't really care much about that. They did care about our ability to earn, but they didn't think it was contingent upon a degree back then. We think that now, but their generation didn't think like that. But I did notice that they were very observant of the kind of personality that the children were becoming. Characteristics, our temperaments, how we behave towards our siblings, and then picking up on that and so on. How proactive they were in addressing that is a different conversation. But I do remember, at least in my childhood, and I spent a lot of time around my dad's friends, and I noticed one of the things that I observed, and I recall observing, was that they paid a lot of attention to your personality, right? And I think that's something that all parents need to do intensely, right? And then do the next bit, which is ensure interventions, and find ways to kind of steer them away from bad characteristics. Embed within them strong characteristics and good characteristics, and so on, like some of the things that I mentioned.
Okay. On the point about justice and balance, you mentioned about absent fathers. Somebody could say here that fathers tend to only be absent because they have a responsibility to work and provide. So especially with parents from let's say the 90s and 2000s, a lot of them used to work in restaurants, which is usually in evening or night shifts, or taxi work, for example, which, depending on where you want the money, is typically it's typically a night shift. So then if children are at school from 9 o'clock until, let's just say 3 o'clock or 3:30, and then depending on how old they are, they go to maktab or fara, as we say in Bangla, from 5 to 7 or 7:30, and then their fathers are at work from around 5 o'clock until, let's just say, 1 a.m. because they have to earn a living so the children can have a comfortable living. So how do you balance the responsibility of earning and going out to work with the responsibility of being present with raising your children?
So let's first accept that a lot of absent parents are just that. They're absent. They're absent, right? They're not in the children's lives. So let's first identify that, right? And set it aside as we do have a problem with complete absence. Parents who have to be away from their children because of work are in a better position. Already, they're in a better position because they're providing for their children and they have some presence. But rather than give a formulaic answer to this, right, this is what I would say to those parents. Like, if you're a parent like that who has to be away from home, I'd ask you this question, which is that if your child is, say, 6, 7 years old, they've gone past sinnu tamiz, as we say in in our Islamic literature, a child becomes discerning after 7. In fact, the Sharia is so fixed on this idea that it regards them as discerning, right? Meaning they can, and discerning means that they can tell right from wrong. They start to develop what I said before, judgment. So you've got a child that's above 7 years of age, 7, 8, 9, and now some girls are more mature than boys. We've all made that observation. Can you sit a child who's that age now? Take that Sinnu Timi's age, add another 5 to it, add another 10 to it, and then imagine yourself having a conversation with that child, right? Who is in fact 7, 8, 9, but we've put them somewhere in the future in terms of their age. You'll sit and have a conversation and ask yourself, can you reasonably justify your level of absence and presence based on your circumstances? Can you do it? If you're confident that you can, you don't have a lot of opportunities, and therefore it forces you to go out for work elsewhere. You tried to find local work for years and years, and it still didn't work. I don't know, whatever it may be, right? Your justification, whatever that justification might be. Do you think your child would accept your explanation? Especially a child that felt your absence. Would your child accept that explanation? If the answer is no, you need to change things. If the answer is yes, you probably still need to change this because you do fall in the absent category, but you're in a better position. But one thing you should do now, so let's forget the future, come back, now that you're back to your child being 8, 9 years old and so on, is you need to have conversations with your children about your work, about the nature of your work, about why you do it. Look, I work, this is how much children feel it, right? And I don't know, maybe my little one's a little bit spoiled because of what I'm about to tell you, right? So I work in my garage, converted my garage to an office. I work in here. So my commute is from the living room, cross a little piece of the garden and come here. But I get immersed. Okay. So I'm gone, 3, 4 hours, 5 hours, I'm gone. I'm in here, I'm working. And I've been noticing this a lot in the summer holidays. My 8-year-old will come strolling in here and I'll be like, I'm working, Baba, what are you doing? And he'll say, I just miss you. Can I just stay here while you work? And then if he doesn't come in here, or like if I'm doing something like this, recording or something, that means that I can't be disturbed. And I've told them, I'll go back in and he'll say to me, why do you have to work all the time? Like that, right? And I'm literally 15 feet away, right? 20 feet away. You understand? So do children feel it when their when their father or their mother is, 30 miles, 40 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles away? Absolutely they do. So what I have to do now with my youngest is I have to sit down. I have a conversation about the nature of work and why it's necessary, and how fathers have to provide for their children, and how we have to make the most out of the time that we have when we do have time together. So when I'm back in the living room or whatever, then perhaps don't carry on watching your cartoons or doing, come and spend some time with me. That conversation is really, really important. If you're absent and for work and you feel justified in yourself, then you come home, and then at home you spend no time with the children, no quality time, there's no conversation, there's no dialogue, nothing, right? You're just a provider, right? You're just sitting there watching them. Then on top of absence, you also have no relationship. You have no relationship with them. So therefore you are always absent. At work you're physically absent, at home you're emotionally absent. Still absence, right?
Yeah.
That is something also that has a detrimental impact on children.
So on that point about physical absence and emotional absence, if we flip that in terms of presence. So, as fathers or mothers as well, but I think it applies more so to fathers, that you have to be physically present, but also emotionally
I'm
present.
telling you, it applies to mothers as well. And I think at some point, whether in this session or another session, we should talk about how the parent, mothers mainly, who are actually at home, can end up being totally absent from a young child's life. Like a child that needs their presence, they can be absent from it. There are
Okay,
some
so
very, very
let's talk
strong
about both of them
manifestations of that.
now, because my
Yeah,
question is actually, what does it mean to be emotionally present? What is emotion like, especially if you come from a background where you don't really, expressing emotions or showing emotions was kind of taboo, or it's looked at as a sign of, either weakness or a bit socially strange.
yeah,
Then, so those who may not have necessarily seen examples of emotional affection in their homes, when they are now parents, what do they do and what do they say and how are they
yeah,
supposed to, how do they show
yeah.
what does it mean to be
Look,
emotionally present for
look,
men and for women?
I don't want to go down the route of laying blame. Everybody had their circumstances. Everybody has their own upbringing. Everybody has their culture. Culture plays a big part. I know this. Um, but even in our parents' generation, and by the way, when I say parents' generation, I'm saying it as somebody in their 50s, right? So in our parents' generation, I appreciate that, there are people who are now second generation, and I interact with them a lot, and I often make the mistake of thinking they're in the same position as me. They're not. Their parents are people I grew up with, and I'm increasingly finding this, this to be the reality, and it's quite depressing, to be honest, as you realize that you are seriously getting old. But my parents' generation, people were very, very, very diverse, right? Um, and emotional presence isn't about the presence of emotions in the conventional sense. Emotional presence is about being in your child's life or spending time with your child in a manner in which all of your emotion, all your emotional self, which is a different thing, your emotional self is activated, right? Minimum is being physically present, sharing the space with them. They're in the garden, you're there. Okay. So I'll give you a very passive kind of example of emotional presence. Your child is playing, you're in the same space, you're watching your child play, and you're taking joy from watching them play. All right. So you're present, you're not engaged, but you taking joy out of watching your children play is an emotional engagement, right? So you are emotionally present. Um, it's a small dimension of the whole of what we make dua for. رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ, right? In that moment, as you take joy from watching your children play, not pray, not read Quran, none of that stuff. Just play. You take joy. And this is often, most every parent has experienced this with their children when they're really young. All right. Then children reach a certain age where even that level of presence goes away, right? Because now they make too much noise, right? They're screaming and shouting, they're fighting, etc. It's not as joyful anymore, and so parents start to withdraw from that space or stop them from doing that, right? You still have to be present, and you still have to be emotionally present, and you have to see the joy in that as well. So that's a very, very basic example. Now you can move on to examples of being physically present, emotionally engaged, even passively. So in that case, it was one way, right? The parent was just taking joy, but now becoming actively emotionally engaged, right? And that could be you're sharing in your child's emotions because you're asking about how your child's day went. You're asking about what they think, what they feel about certain things, right? And that can be anything. It could be how comes you like Lego so much? Oh, I like Lego because it whatever. Yeah. I really like making things. and then you have a conversation where you engage with whatever it is that they feel. um, it could be about school and being bullied at school, and then you're emotionally empathically engaged with that. You try to recognize how that feels, and then you respond in that way. It's not like a quick rebuff, oh, you need to be tougher, or I don't know, worse still, hit them back, or just anger. I'll talk to your teacher and I'll deal with it. Don't worry. How dare they? It's something more in between, something more empathic. So that kind of thing is extremely important. And what that does is it gradually builds this connection to parents and reduces the possibility later on. This is just one part of parenting. It reduces the possibility later on of children doing things that would disappoint their parents, because this type of emotional presence and engagement results in a very, very strong loyalty. Right? If your child does something wrong and they show no remorse for it, you can probably tie that to that relationship being absent. As opposed to a child who's done something wrong, and all children will do things wrong that parents think is wrong, right? As opposed to a child who does something wrong, gets caught by their parents, and then shows really, really powerful remorse because they've just recognized that they've disappointed their parents. That, I think, doesn't come automatically. That's something that is built through present parenting, through emotionally engaged parenting, and so on. Because now that child has got caught by their parents, they've disappointed their parents, and it will definitely present itself as remorse, as tears, and so on and so forth. But if they don't have that relationship, they don't care if they're upsetting their parents, at least not while they're teenagers and they've got hormones racing through them.
So when it comes to being emotionally present, if you're talking about having, these types of conversations and think about, asking them about their thoughts and feelings, we see an example of this in the life of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and his son during the famous incident of the slaughter that didn't happen, basically. So those of us who grow up, of course, we grow up in Britain, or you're surrounded by Christian culture. There are two versions of this story that people can tend to hear. So when it comes to the Christian narrative, and I don't say the biblical narrative here, because the biblical narrative and the Christian narrative do seem a little bit different. So when people are, hear of the Christian version of this story, they find it really, difficult to swallow, and it's quite, emotionally jarring, to the point where a lot of people end up becoming atheist because of this particular story, and Christian philosophers have obviously written to justify, argue against it. Now, when we look at the Quranic narrative, when we look at what the Quran has to say about it, this is completely different. Of course, the story is the same story, but there is a lot more of an emotional bond there. There's a communication there where Ibrahim alayhi salam expresses his vulnerability and speaks to his son Ismail, and he says, "Inni ara fil manami anni adbahuk, fanzur madha tara." That I see in my dream that I'm offering you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now tell me, how do you feel about it? What do you think about it? So fanzur madha tara. So that conversation there just changes the entire perspective of it. But if we look at that, beyond just the story, and look at it from the perspective of parenting, what you see is that the greats before us, and of course we as Muslims are supposed to follow the Millat Ibrahim, or the tradition of Abraham. So the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam was all about Tawheed, was all about the oneness of God, and it's all about serving the one true God. So then, now that he's finding a conflict between serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and offering his firstborn, he's speaking to his son and clearly taking him seriously, and considering him mature enough to have this conversation, and not just belittling him, or not just
tricking him,
thinking he's too
deceiving him.
young, tu bustanai, you're too young, and things like that.
Yeah.
And then if you look at Ismail's response, they said, Ya abati fa'al ma tu'mar. Oh, my beloved father, do as you are commanded. Satajiduni insha'Allah min as-sabirin. If God wills, then you will find me patient, you will find me enduring. So that kind of relationship that you see there
Yeah.
is something I think
I think
we don't.
obviously that story is, would be at first is jarring anyway. Forget the Christian narrative, even the Muslim narrative is jarring. But but yes, it does, and ulama use this as an example a lot. But I do. There is one little caution I'd like to put forward here. In a narrative style tradition, where information is narrated over time, one of the things we have to remember is there is a lot of real life information missing. Things that people don't think they have to report because it's just part of everyday life. Who wouldn't know that a father sits with his children, or who wouldn't know that fathers and sons and daughters do certain things together, and so on. So those things don't get reported as much, right? So therefore we have to look for tidbits, whether it's this story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, or for example, I would say an even more powerful story is father and son building the Kaaba together. All right, because parents and children doing things together is a powerful example of presence and engagement, right? Because usually there's conversation, doing the activity makes all of it functional and very real, right? So they're building the Kaaba together and so on. And you can just extract little bits from the Prophet ﷺ's life about how young people used to be when they used to get involved in community and society, and and in the masjid and so on and so forth. In the case of nowadays, us with the nuclear family being the focus, um, the pair, what off people often aren't thinking in terms of, oh, is this in the Sunnah or not? It's a lot simpler than that. There is often blatant neglect of presence and engagement with children. And if you sat with that parent, you wouldn't have to quote too much Quran and Hadith to them to help them recognize that that's not good enough.
Yeah.
Right? It's basic common sense. And on the flip side, parents who think about these things are doing it because they know they have to do it. They're not necessarily looking for evidence for it. And this is the bit. If there's a small percentage of people who are like, no, I'm only going to parent according to what I clearly find in the Quran and Sunnah, right? Then I reckon they'd find a lot of, they might, first of all, most people's reading of Quran and Sunnah is very limited.
Yeah.
And they might end up deluded into thinking that there isn't all that much, about presence. There isn't all that much in the Sunnah. Well, there isn't all that much because of the fact that there's a lot that hasn't been reported. So I'm going to say quick. So therefore, I'll add a quick note about what life was like back then. You don't have to go very far. From about 200 years ago, maybe even less, right? From then until maybe, I don't know, 10,000 years, depending on how you calculate history, right? 10,000 years previous, 20,000 years previous, 30,000 years previous, the changes in society have not been all that much, right? Fundamentally, society has operated the same way. Like a jarring statistic, just 50 years ago, the world's population, 50 or 60 years ago, the population of the whole world was about 2.5 billion. It's shocking to think that it's 7-8 billion now, right? So the change from that point all the way back to 10,000 years is not that substantial, right? But the change from like the last 200 years to 100 years ago, then the last century, it's been crazy. It's been astronomical, right? So when you go back, and therefore it's easy to kind of predict what it would have been like for them back then. And the simple answer is society was structured in a way, society operated in a way where parents, fathers, and mothers were just more present. They had to be. Children had to start helping out around the house earlier. They had to mature earlier. Boys got involved, even girls. I've seen this in my childhood, right? Boys and girls getting more active in agriculture and so on and so forth. When they went to school, school finished earlier. School finished earlier so that they could get involved, right? Even in this country, what was, if you go into the history of why there's summer holidays, it's so that everybody can be involved in the harvest, right? And so on. So all of these things tell you that back then, if you go past what we might call modern life, right? There are so many ways in which, even if a parent wasn't consciously present, or rather, let me rephrase that. Even if a parent wasn't consciously trying to be present in their children's life, right? The way society was structured, the way life unfolded, meant that they were present inevitably. I think that's a really, really important thing to recognize when we think about the past and we draw from the past and we draw from the Sunnah. It's a completely different paradigm.
Okay, that's beautiful, mashallah. So going back to the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam and his son Ismail building the Kaaba together. Now, we can of course look at that as, father and son bonding time, they're building together, they're doing things together. But we can also look at it, in terms of the Muslim parent, that they are building a house to worship, in which to worship God, and to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and maintaining their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and establishing tawheed in the children's lives. So in modern Britain,
and Ibrahim alayhi salam making the dua, his son would have been present there, and the vision, like the vision he demonstrates in that dua, his son would have been present in that. This is all tarbiyah.
So when it comes to doing this, I think a lot of parents wouldn't necessarily be as comfortable in discussing the details or the more sensitive aspects of religion to their teenagers. So considering we have the Unbreakable program, where we specifically catering to 14 to 18-year-olds to discuss these topics and to mentor them, how do you go about doing this? What exactly does Unbreakable offer to the British Muslim parent today that is in line with something we can learn from Ibrahim?
I think before we talk about educational offerings and so on, I think, look, I run a madrasa now, right? So after the ivory tower of Ibrahim College, I spent a few years setting up and running Mawarid Lifestyle and what was then the youth mentoring program, which got rebranded thanks to one of our friends. And so what is now the Unbreakable program, I did that first. And then I kind of ended up where I am now, and got involved in a madrasa project. And I thought, okay, let's work with the younger age group. This is important. It's grassroots. And we started working with 5 to 14-year-olds. Remember that Unbreakable and the youth mentoring program is 14 to 18-year-olds, right? And the things I learned and the insights, because before that I'd worked with children years ago, like 1999. Yeah, 1998 till about 2004, 5, right? I was working with children. And then kind of from a distance, right? Because I helped set up a secondary school, and then another one under Ibrahim College, and then we had madrasas of our own. But I wasn't working with the kids; it was more governance or management. And now working closely with them, one of the things that I've realized is, of course, about parents, because you're dealing with the parents as well, hundreds of them, yeah. And the thing I've realized about parents is that they have to do more to show, first and foremost, that whatever provision, Islamic educational provision, they put their children into is the most important educational provision in their lives. Parents have to proactively do that, right? Even if that means they have to say things that undermine other educational provision. So I regularly, even though when the time comes, we push them, but I regularly will say to my kids, I don't care about your secular education. Show me that you take your Islamic education seriously. But then when it comes to their GCSEs, etc., we push them to do well, right? We provide them with the tutors, etc., etc. It's the cultural paradigm kind of applies sufficient pressure anyway. So what I try to do is I consciously say to them, this is the most important thing. That's not all that important, right? I often say to my kids, if you don't get a degree, if you don't get a professional career, but you become good Muslims and you have a good Islamic education, maybe you've memorized the Quran, or you show that you've taken your Islamic character development seriously, and you're still connected. You're reading Islamic books, you're practicing the deen, and the kind of people you hang around with is also consistent with that. As a parent, I will consider myself to be successful. As a parent, like Allah, I've done my job. You said I'm a shepherd and I'm going to be asked about it. I feel better about that. I feel better about my responsibility. But if you had the best GCSEs, the best A levels, got a first in your degree, got into Oxford, Cambridge, did a PhD, then got into a lucrative career, because sometimes PhDs don't, earn a lot of money, right? So you got to deal with that. And you got into a lucrative career and you did really, really well. But on the deen side, you were weak, right? I would consider myself to have failed as a parent. I proactively have this conversation with my kids. So parents have to do more to demonstrate what is the most important. This is one of the early points of failure when it comes to, again, I'm saying failure, but call it whatever you like. This is one of the early points. This is one of the first challenges that we face, and we often fail this one for the simple reason that with our words, forget about actions. Actions are different. With our words, we will often demonstrate. With the acceptance of absence from madrasa versus non-acceptance of absence in school, we will demonstrate. With showing concern for school homework over concern for madrasa homework, we will demonstrate that Islamic education provision is not important. And this is what we as educators face in real life. Parents will ensure that their children's school attendance is 98%, even 100%. But there's that same child's madrasa attendance will barely be 75%. What possible reason could there be for that? Right? For that difference. I had a
Sheikh,
parent.
there could be quite a
sit in-
few legitimate explanations
No.
for that.
I don't agree. I don't care. I don't care what parents say. I don't agree. My child, my child's attendance, I have the same concerns as anybody else, right? One parent is working, not at home. We figure out a way, and my child's attendance in school and in madrasa is exactly the same. I wouldn't be surprised if madrasa attendance was slightly higher, right? Madrasa punctuality was slightly higher, because obviously,
Is your madrasa running on a weekend and not on a weekday?
yeah. And
Yeah, so I
so,
think that would be the
that's the
fundamental
observation,
difference there.
right? Evenings, I understand there could be issues in the evening, but come on, right? From like, it's difficult in our town because children have to go quite a distance, right? But most places in the UK have a local masjid that kids can walk to, right? It's been there. We've been, look, another perspective that I have is I've been to madrasa in this country.
Yeah.
I grew up here, right? So I went to madrasa in the 80s. Do you understand? And we've seen this. I've seen this problem as a child back then, because my dad's making sure that I'm going to madrasa on a daily basis, and then my mates are like, at least once a week or once every 2 weeks, they're chilling at home watching movies, and I'm like, why is my father so strict about this?
Yeah.
Do you understand what
So
I
I think
mean?
for
So I think coming back to all I was trying to say is before the role of educational provision, whether it's madrasa or whether it's the Unbreakable program or the equivalent of that, there is this role at home. There is a narrative that needs to be built around what's important, right? You know, I was just about to tell you that I've sat in my office talking to a parent, talking about their child's progress in their Islamic education, and the parent turned around and said to me, "I don't want all of this. You know, just give me the bare minimum and that's it." Like, forget about being unaware or just allowing us a certain order of priorities to kind of set it into our minds because of just the way life is in the West and so on and so forth. I mean, here's a parent that consciously wants to diminish their child's Islamic education because he has other priorities, and he's consciously saying it as a pushback to their child's Islamic teacher. So I think before we go into provision, this is very, very important. The parental role is extremely important. Any Islamic educational provision, madrasa, unbreakable course, etc., anything that you do on top of that is on top.
Yeah.
Even like you and I went to Darul Ulum, this applies even to that, right? Because if you send one of your children to Darul Ulum and you've sent the rest of them to university, that gives a message. It makes a Darul Ulum kid think, well, what did I do right to deserve this? Or what did I do wrong to deserve this? You see what I mean? So I think we've got to recognize that in a child's education, beyond, like, I'm not saying they have to teach tajweed to their kids themselves. This is just creating a certain worldview in children by modeling your own worldview. What is your worldview when it comes to your children? Right? Something has to be modeled. And what parents are modeling at the moment is of concern to me.
So, Sheikh, I think
Not quite
for
answer to the question you asked, but I think this is more important to recognize.
definitely, mashallah. So, I think for the listener, they will probably sit here listening to this thinking, hold on a minute. Sheikh Shams is speaking from a place of privilege here, where, he had a great father who was, physically present, emotionally present, and religiously aware or religiously literate. And then now that you yourself are, you've studied, you're a well-regarded da'i and educator, and now that you're a parent yourself, not that now you're a parent yourself and you're a teacher, so you can, as a scholar, you're in a position to guide your children in a way that the vast majority of Muslim parents in this country just simply can't. So in terms of their responsibilities for the average parent, I think a lot of it, of course, they can't shirk away from their responsibilities, but the things that you can do as a scholar is something that they can't do. So I think for them, the responsibility will have to be to provide an education for their children, to provide the Islamic knowledge and familiarity and our beliefs and ideologies. Not necessarily that they can transfer those to their own children, just because they are either, even if they know the answers or have the answers, they just can't communicate that in an age appropriate or child friendly way. So, on that point, you started during the COVID era. You started the Unbreakable program, specifically targeting the sensitive topics that not every parent can deal with. Not only, I would go a little bit further and say not every imam can deal with as well. So, what is it exactly that you're doing at Unbreakable, and how does it make somebody's faith unbreakable?
All right, so I'm going to come to that in a minute, right? So first of all, it's true that I do come from a position of privilege, but it's not generational privilege. And my privilege, and I speak about this in my khutbahs, that I had a privileged upbringing because I had a religious upbringing, right? So I had a privileged upbringing because my father chose, I was talented. He saw the talent, and he chose Darul Uloom over Oxford and Cambridge because I could have been over there. right? I have a privileged upbringing because to this day, my father asks me how my salah is rather than how much money I'm earning, right? He asks me how much of my dini work am I doing for free. This is, I'm telling you, like, this is fact, yeah? So he'll say to me, how much of your dini work are you doing without pay? Because that's the only one you can be truly sincere about. You need to evaluate that. You understand? And we'll get in, and he'll make me feel uncomfortable, and we'll get into a whole kind of. So that's my privilege. That's my privilege, right? Genuinely. My father doesn't come from a privileged background. You know, he grew up an orphan. He was illiterate, didn't know how to read and write, and so on. But he found Deen through, you know, through Tablighi Jamaat, you know, and so on. He found Deen in his 20s. All right. And that became the reason for our privilege as his children. And what did he do? Right. So yes, number one, you know, he read hadith every day at home, every other day at home. That's it. He spoke to us about deen, spoke to us about priorities, did not speak to us about money. Which parent can't do that? Tell me, what's so complicated about that? Don't talk to your children about money. Don't make money the most important thing in your children's lives. Don't talk about how much money they're going to have to learn. They're going to have to earn until they're much older. Show them the more important priorities, right? Akhirah, pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on. Every parent is capable of doing that. And look, if we used AI now, right, and we asked AI to take out all of the actionable parts of this discussion today, I think I've been quite conscious in proposing actionable tasks for parents that every parent can do without any qualification. So I think I'd like everybody to just pay attention to that for a second. Now coming to Unbreakable. Okay, so there is a specific challenge, right? And I know we debated a lot about focusing the parenting conversation around teenagers. Unbreakable picks up when the problems have already, when the assumption is that the problems have taken root. So kids they've gone to secondary school, right? They've received an unfit for purpose madrasa education that they are now almost graduating from or have already graduated from. And then at a time when their madrasa education goes further into the background, because now it's year 10, now it's year 11, GCSEs become front and center, right? But also hormones are kicking in. They're starting to feel attraction towards the opposite sex. Their ideas are crystallizing as their own, right? They are consciously adopting other ideas. And now with smartphones and the internet and social media and so on and so forth, they're being bombarded. At that time, the Muslim community reduces, as a community, we do this to our teenagers, right? We reduce the presence of guidance in their life. Now the madrasa hours reduced, etc., etc. So what? I would say the majority of children who attended madrasa at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, after 14, the majority end up out of madrasa education, right? So in summary, when they need it the most, they get taken out of it. And the Unbreakable was, initially, it was simply, okay, kids are out of madrasa education or going out of madrasa education. How about this program to ensure that they get something that doesn't clash with their GCSEs, with their other priorities, because it's only 2 hours a week, but it also focuses on the things they need now, so that some of the questions that have already planted themselves like a disease in their heads around Islam, right, are answered, and they build resilience so they can handle the next step, sixth form, university, where they face further challenges. They can handle that. And should they need someone to go back to, someone to speak to, they have a mentor in their life, right? That's the basic idea of unbreakable. So we talk, instead of talking about what is Islam and what do you have to do as a Muslim. The conversation is around why is Islam true, right? And what are the challenges where do the attacks against Islam and against you as a Muslim come from? And how do we build resilience against those things? And including spirituality as a form of resilience building. So we cover khushu' and things like that. Early on, it was just a 1-year course. And then I realized 1 year isn't enough. And that after that, once there's some degree of commitment, etc., it's necessary for young people to go on and solidify their fiqh and study more about Islamic lifestyle and so on. So it became a 3-year program. And in Unbreakable as well, I've been doing it for 6 years now. In Unbreakable as well, the challenge is prioritization, right? Making sure that the majority of parents prioritize Unbreakable, which is only once a week, right? This is still the issue, because the attitude still is, I put them in Unbreakable, khalas, that's it, I can be rest assured, as opposed to, what did you discuss today? Let's talk about it. I want to learn from you or whatever. And this sounds really, really important. We've got to make sure you attend this every week. That doesn't happen, right? That doesn't happen. So we still struggle with that. But alhamdulillah, it's something. My last point on that is Unbreakable is something that obviously we're delivering. But Unbreakable needs to be something that exists as something like Unbreakable, right? Needs to exist in every single masjid, in every single community, inshallah.
Okay. So on that point, Sheikh, just before we wrap up, those who might have heard about Unbreakable for the first time, listen to the podcast, how can they look into it more, and when does the next year start, and is there a website? What can they look at, or how can they get in touch?
So yeah, for anybody that's interested in Unbreakable, they can just go to the Mawarid Lifestyle website, mawaridlifestyle.com, or just /Unbreakable, mawaridlifestyle.com /Unbreakable, and they'll get all of the details, and they can just enroll right from there, inshallah ta'ala. It is online. My hope is, inshallah, that I can start some sort of a campaign to try to convince communities to establish local face-to-face provision. We've managed to do that in Chelmsford, alhamdulillah, because I was here at the masjid. We've reached a position now where it is simply a continuation of the madrasa. So children finish at the madrasa, move on to youth mentoring, right? So we've done that here. That's the model. But I'd like to see that, if possible, in every single masjid. And if I was to leave with a vision, then the vision would be a vision statement. The vision statement would be every community provides fit for purpose Islamic education from childhood to adulthood. It doesn't stop at the most vulnerable years, but it continues into adulthood. And to make that manageable until their GCSEs, it's intense, it's significant number of hours and so on and so forth. And from there, it's more limited mentoring type provision for young people. And my more recent thinking is that every child should get some sort of mentoring from like Sindut Tamiz onward. They should have a mentor that they can relate to, because children don't always relate to their children. An Islamic mentor. But anyway, that's Unbreakable.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Shams, for coming onto the podcast, and inshallah we'll have plenty of more episodes yet to come. And thank you for all the listeners. And inshallah we hope to see you in the next episode. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.